Sophie Dr. Afridi, and I am the director of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Interfaith Education Center. I'm also professor of religion and philosophy. So welcome. We have another event next Thursday, actually celebrating Nostra Aetate. And if you don't know what's Nostra Aetate, well, that's our fault because we're a Catholic university. It's the anniversary of Vatican II. And in 1965, Vatican II decided that Jews were equal believers as Catholics, and they added Muslims to that. So in the spirit of that, I was actually hired for this job. So if you want to come, it's a movie and a discussion between a Catholic and a Jew about Nostra Aetate, and that's in Hayden 100 at 6 o'clock. Anyway, I just wanted to introduce our honorable speaker, Dr. Ed Kissy. He has traveled all the way today from Florida to be with us, and he's leaving early in the morning, hence the life of professors, teaching and giving presentations. So I really appreciate him being here. I want to say a few personal things about him. I met him at the University of Nebraska. When was that at? I can't remember. Last spring? Spring. Where he gave the plenary speech, and he's just an amazing lecturer and speaker, and his work is really fascinating to me. So, and then we had some conversations, and then after that we met in Santa Cruz, California. So we've been together on the West Coast, the Midwest, and now the East Coast. We gotta go south, right? We gotta go south, maybe Alabama or something, right? So anyway, I'm just happy to meet him. He's a phenomenal person, a great speaker, and a great scholar. And he is at the University of South Florida. He's in the Global Interdisciplinary Department, as well as in Africana Studies. He also did work with the United Nations, where he wrote papers and documents about the Holocaust. It's very kind of rare that you have an African scholar doing the Holocaust, but we have examples that are different, right? And this is why I invite speakers to the center that can give a voice to something in a different way. Perhaps you can relate to some of the stories that HGI brings to you. And this is actually for you and for your education in the future. And he's also in a new documentary that is going to be on, what channel is it, on PBS or?
January.
In January. So look out for him. This man is a star and is known internationally, nationally, and in all circles that have to do with colonization, African studies, and the Holocaust. So let's welcome Dr. Kissy. Yes, I'm doing it.
Thank you very much, Professor Afridi, for a durable introduction. And thank you very much also to everybody who has made it here. You could have been somewhere else. And our students, you could have used your time profitably. And so I am very grateful to you that you have chosen to be here, to be a part of this conversation. I must say that my visit to Manhattan University this evening is a product of coincidence. Coincidence in the sense that I met Professor Afridi at the University of Nebraska last spring. And I must say that my decision to accept her invitation to speak here, not on any topic, but on anti-Semitism, is because of what she said about anti-Semitism and the illuminating perspectives that she shared during our time at Nebraska. And immediately after her wonderful presentation on anti-Semitism, I reached out to her and then asked if I could pick her mind for my own interest, because prior to meeting her at Nebraska, I had been asked by the president of my university, University of South Florida in Tampa, to serve on a presidential anti-Semitism committee. And a presidential anti-Semitism committee that was constituted to advise the president on how to combat anti-Semitism on campus. And coming on the heels of campus anti-Semitic flare-ups at Columbia and other places, that was a particularly onerous responsibility. And so I was very eager to pick the mind of Professor Afridi on what I could do in order to contribute to the activities of the Presidential Advisory Committee. So, in a sense, my visit here is a product of that encounter, and of course, my own interest in aspects of Holocaust history. 1 month ago today, I was at Auschwitz. I had been invited by UNESCO and the US Holocaust Memorial Museum as one of 5 scholars invited to speak to a group of 53 ministers of education and educators and curricular developers from 19 countries around the world. 14 of them from the African continent. And we met at Auschwitz in order to think about how to integrate Holocaust history into peace education initiatives of countries around the world that are implementing UNESCO's global Holocaust education programs. And I was invited specifically to speak about Africa's historical and cultural connections to the Holocaust. And I was telling Professor Afridi jokingly that, in fact, if I am not overstating it, at least at this moment, I may be the only African scholar who studies the Holocaust in the world, because I have been invited to many places to speak about Africa's connections to the Holocaust, and I have looked for African scholars and I have found none. So I found myself at Auschwitz the first time I have been there. It was a sobering experience for me 1 month ago today, as we did a walk through Auschwitz-Birkenau I, Auschwitz-Birkenau II. And for those of you who have had that visual encounter with the Holocaust, you are taken around by docents, and then you have an earphone, and then they take you through various buildings at Auschwitz. And then they give you an oral or verbal tour of what the Nazis tried to do. And so we got to a place where you have various television screens spewing out some of the venomous anti-Semitic speeches of Nazi officials and then other sympathizers of the Nazi regime. And as I listened to some of these Nazi anti-Semitic speeches, I tried to process them through an African prism. And by that I mean, I asked myself, how did people on the African continent know about this, if they knew it at all? Did people in Africa hear about, read about Nazi anti-Semitic vitriol? And if they did, as colonial subjects, subjects of European empires, how did that resonate with them? How did colonial subjects on the African continent view and discuss anti-Semitism before and during the Holocaust? And that question is very rarely asked in Holocaust history. You will never find any book on the Holocaust in which any scholar has tried to wrestle with that question. How did subjects of European colonial empires on the African continent view and discuss anti-Semitism, particularly the anti-Semitic speeches that I heard in the rooms at Auschwitz-Birkenau 1 and 2 that I visited? And so, in reflecting on my encounter with Professor Afridi at Nebraska, where I picked her mind on what I could do to help the Presidential Anti-Semitism Committee, and then also going through Auschwitz and reflecting on what possibly must have happened on the African continent, particularly in the African press that reported on Holocaust news, I began to think that the invitation that Professor Alfredi had already extended to me, and I was wondering what I could say at Manhattan University that would make sense to young, enterprising students who are coming up to be leaders of tomorrow. I decided that I should speak on the African press on anti-Semitism during the Holocaust. Clearly, the influential African press, about which I will be speaking fairly shortly, particularly between 1933 and 1945, saw the Holocaust in Europe at this period as the outcome of anti-Semitism. Now, although their editors and correspondents differed in their interpretations of the manifestations of anti-Semitism, they shared a view of the phenomenon as a variant of colonial racism and a type of Christian European paganism. Africans saw or viewed anti-Semitism as a form of racism and a form of Christian paganism. And it looks like this particular conversation is appropriate in a Catholic university. Now, this fact, viewing anti-Semitism as a form of Christian paganism and as a version of racism, that fact is evident, is very clear in how the African press discussed Nazi racial policy and Nazi colonial interests, and the 4 critical features of Nazi anti-Jewish actions about which I will be speaking in a moment. For the African press, while anti-Semitism had a distinct anti-Jewish meaning, it existed on a broad spectrum of ancient prejudices and had an existential implications for African humanity and African humanism. So in this presentation, I will define anti-Semitism simply as hatred of Jews. Now, that is how people in West Africa, whose perspectives on anti-Semitism that I am examining, viewed anti-Semitism. The period of interest to me is 1933 to 1945, between the rise of the Nazi state and the end of the Holocaust. This interest and this particular period raised one salient question. Did hatred of Jews as a sentiment exist anywhere in West Africa before and during this time? If anti-Semitism existed in West Africa before 1933, then how did the press in Africa deal with anti-Semitism with which they were already familiar? And if anti-Semitism did not exist in West Africa prior to 1933, then how did the African press wrestle with a new phenomenon, a phenomenon with which they were not familiar? From the research that I have done, there is no persuasive evidence of the existence of anti-Semitism as I have defined it here, as hatred of Jews in West Africa before and during the Holocaust. None. In fact, the historian Richard Hall has noted in his book, Jews and Judaism in African History, that Jews had interacted with the Soninke, the Wolof, the Igbo, the Mande, and the Akan, indigenous and predominantly agricultural, pastoralist, and Muslim people in this region since the 13th century. So people in West Africa had lived with Jews as far back as 1200. And Jews from Morocco, North Africa, possibly Sephardic Jews, and their co-religionists from Europe, possibly Ashkenazi Jews, were so fully integrated into West Africa's farming, pastoral, and metalworking communities that Jews were indistinguishable from the local West African population. Foreign Jews from Morocco, Spain, and Portugal lived in West Africa and played significant roles in various West African economies as artisans, blacksmiths, makers of blade weapons, and weavers of textiles. Jews built their synagogues and practiced their faith undisturbed in West African societies, even as some indigenous groups in West Africa embraced European Christian religions such as Catholicism and other Protestant faiths with their known anti-Semitic theologies. Some local people like the Igbo of present-day Nigeria, the Akan of my own country Ghana, the Wolof of present-day Senegal, even adopted Judaism as a religious faith and began to call themselves Jews, or identify themselves with a notable global Jew that they had heard or read about, Jesus of Nazareth. I have corroborated Richard Hall's observations of the presence and positive influence of Jews in West African history in my book about which Professor Afridi spoke, Africans and the Holocaust, Perceptions and Responses of Colonized and Sovereign Peoples, Routledge 2020. And there is no evidence that I and other scholars who have studied Jewish life in West Africa have found about hatred and mistreatment of local and foreign Jews who made West Africa their home. So why then did anti-Semitism, as I have defined it in this presentation, become a critical issue of interest in the West African press between the rise of Nazism and the onset of the Holocaust in Europe? From 1933 to 1945, the influential West and East African press, namely the West African Pilot in Nigeria, the Daily Guardian in Sierra Leone, and the Gold Coast Independent in the Gold Coast, and to a limited extent, the Uganda Herald in East Africa, Uganda, and the Ethiopian Herald in Ethiopia in East Africa, reprinted foreign articles on the hateful treatment of Jews in Europe and featured editorials and special columns on anti-Semitism. There are four distinct but also interrelated ways in which these influential newspapers in Africa at this time viewed and discussed anti-Semitism. And I sent the outline of my presentation to Professor Alfredi to put on the screen when I was an undergraduate student and I attended lectures. I wanted something on the screen so I know when the lecturer is going to stop so that I can go home. So you can follow my presentation as I have laid it out there. There are four distinct but also interrelated ways in which the influential newspapers in Africa that I have mentioned viewed and discussed anti-Semitism. First, they saw anti-Semitism as a form of prejudice similar to racism, with which they were familiar as subjects of European colonial empires. In this perception of anti-Semitism, people in West Africa saw their own fate in a potential Nazi-controlled world through the Nazi treatment of Europe's Jews. In other words, people in Africa paid attention to anti-Semitism in Europe because they viewed anti-Semitism as a form of racism. They followed the treatment of Jews because they anticipated that in the event that the Nazi regime triumphed in the Second World War, Africans will be next. So they saw the fate of Jews as having existential implications for their own humanity. Second, the West African press viewed anti-Semitism as a form of discrimination. Here, the editors of these newspapers and some correspondents saw discrimination against Jews as no different from the forms of discrimination against colonial subjects in all European empires in Africa. But it was the obvious racial affinities between the Jewish victims of anti-Semitism and the European perpetrators of anti-Semitism that struck the African observers. In other words, people in Africa could not understand why white people would be killing white people. They understood that in the colonial context, it is European empire builders who had persecuted and killed Africans. That the idea that a European nation, i.e. Germany, will be seeking to rebuild Europe by eliminating people who look like them really struck people in Africa as ominous indeed. So some Africans, since Africans never distinguished between Jews and Europeans, no African could tell a Jew from a European. they were all the same. And because of that, some newspaper editors and correspondents were perplexed to see or hear about discrimination against Jews. Third, the West and East African press saw anti-Semitism as persecution of Jews. It is this type of anti-Semitism as persecution, and the fourth, anti-Semitism as annihilation, that raised the hackles of the African analysts of this phenomenon in Europe after the rise of the Nazi regime. It is anti-Semitism as persecution and anti-Semitism as annihilation that took a significant part of the African concerns about Nazism. It is also this brand of Nazi anti-Semitism that caused many colonial subjects educated in European missionary schools to pay attention to Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf. These seemingly distinct views of anti-Semitism were intertwined with the African perceptions of Nazi racial policy and colonial interest. As you may have learned in your European history classes, Germany had colonies in Africa too. But Germany's colonies were taken away from it in 1919 when the League of Nations was formed. So Germany had colonies in Tanzania, commonly known as Tanganyika. Germany had a colony Southwest Africa, present-day Namibia, and Germany also had a colony in Cameroon. But these colonies were taken away and given to Britain and France to administer as trusteeships. When the Nazi regime took power, they wanted the colonies back. And so Africans in these colonies paid attention to the Holocaust. Africans in these colonies paid attention to the treatment of Jews. They paid attention to anti-Semitic vitriol because they knew that if this is what the Nazi regime is doing to people who look very much like them, what would happen to them in the event of the return of these colonies to the Nazi state? So it is in this context that one can understand the African obsession, the African press preoccupation with anti-Semitism. So clearly, interest in anti-Semitism in Africa was rooted in African self-interest. Subjects of European empires in Africa understandably viewed anti-Jewish sentiments and actions in Germany as mirror images of anti-African sentiments in European colonial narratives. As the West African Pilot put it in November 19th, 1938, on November 19th, 1938, at the height of Kristallnacht, quote, "The inhuman treatment being meted out to Jews by the German people is the result of the meaningless doctrine of race purity." In other words, they saw anti-Semitism as no different from racism. The meaningless doctrine of race purity, which has become their obsession. This obsessive racial anti-Semitism, the paper noted, foreshadowed possible German treatment of Africans in the future. Two notable publications reveal this connection of anti-Semitism and colonial racism. In September 1933, the Uganda Herald newspaper in Uganda, East Africa, published an article entitled "Another Aspect of Germany and Her Jews." The author, identified as outside contributor, but possibly from Uganda or somewhere in the East Africa region, delivered a message of outrage concerning Nazi violence against German Jews at this time. Jews in Germany, the anonymous author wrote, faced extraordinary treatment. The original intention of Hitlerism, the author noted, was the complete and brutal suppression of Jews in Germany. The Reuters news agency, a frequent source of news in African newspapers, had reported that 8,000 Jewish doctors, 4,000 Jewish lawyers, 2,000 Jewish dentists, and thousands of other Jews have been deprived of their living. And thousands more were fleeing from their fatherland and were starving and were being rendered as refugees in neighboring European countries. So like other African newspapers, the Uganda Herald affirmed the singular and extraordinary nature of the unfolding Nazi persecution of German Jews. German persecution of Jews in Poland had also been front-page news since 1939 in the West African pilot in the British-controlled Nigeria. The paper featured a front-page banner entitled, "Germans Persecute Polish Jews." In other words, African newspapers were actually observing what was happening in Europe. They were reprinting news reports about the treatment of Jews in local African newspapers, and literate Africans were reading them and extracting meaning from them. In other words, they were viewing and interpreting what they were reading from European newspapers through the prism of their own anxieties and fears. So this particular report, entitled "Germans Persecute Polish Jews," came from a source in Budapest, and it listed details of the torture of Polish Jews and other horrible treatments for no other reason that they are Jews. Africans who were sensitive to colonial racism identified psychologically with the plight of Polish Jews. The West African pilot provided one of the most revealing examples of African association of European anti-Semitism with colonial racism. The chief editor, Nnamdi Azikiwe, who became, in 1961, the first president of the new nation Nigeria, devoted his January 10th, 1939 regular column, Inside Stuff. That was the title of his regular column. On the 10th of January 1939, he devoted that particular column to a single subject: anti-Semitism. Azikiwe saw Jews and black Africans as the two groups most targeted for inhumane treatment in human history. He called Jews the most unfortunate branch of the human race. Yet, with a dose of conventional anti-Semitic tropes, Azikiwe, who described himself in this popular column as not necessarily pro-Jewish or anti-Jewish, expressed his empathy for the Jews of the world, whom he saw as having distinguished themselves as members of the human race by the individual contributions of their men and women to the stream of world culture and civilization, past and present. It is these significant contributions of Jews to human culture and civilization, amid the continuing anti-Jewish prejudices and discrimination in Europe, that presented anti-Semitism as an existential threat to Africans as well. On the 9th of November 1938, the West African pilot published rumors of British officials, including Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, having secret negotiations with the Nazi regime to transfer portions of Nigeria to Nazi Germany in order to promote peace in Europe, following the German annexation of Austria and Czechoslovakia in March 1938. The West African pilot noted, and I quote, "If Jews who are members of the Caucasian race, as Germans are not good enough to be Aryans and are being expelled from Germany, then there is no telling to what extent the Nazis will go towards humiliating the Africans. Colonized subjects in Africa struggled to make sense of prejudices and discrimination against Jews as white Europeans by Germans, as white Germans. Let me state it again. That colonized subjects in Africa struggled to make sense of prejudices and discrimination against Jews as white Europeans by Germans, as white Europeans in Europe. In the 1930s, even as British officials reportedly discussed territorial transfers in Africa with Nazi Germany as peace diplomacy, British parliamentarians frequently discussed the persecution of Jews in Germany. Many newspapers in West Africa reported on those discussions. In fact, in April 1933, the Daily Guardian newspaper in the British colony of Sierra Leone in West Africa reported on the persecution of Jews in Germany. The paper obtained this information from the British Parliament. The paper's major concern was violence against Jewish university professors and other professionals for no other reason than they happened to be members of the Jewish community. For this West African newspaper, edited by Western educated Africans who had been educated in missionary schools and whose newspapers were read by literate Sierra Leoneans as well, the Nazi violence against Jews, particularly educated Jews and Jewish professors, had a direct and ominous meaning. Educated people in the colony saw their future fate in the possible Nazi-occupied Africa from the persecution of Jews. If the Jews are persecuting university professors, how would they treat educated Africans in the event that Nazi Germany occupied Africa? The accounts of Ghana from my own country also observed the Nazi persecution of the destruction of Jews, but they interpreted anti-Semitism from the perspective of culture. Here, it was the Nazi disruption of Jewish families through the separation of mothers from their children and the transportation of Jewish family members to different concentration and extermination camps that resonated. The accounts revered the idea of family. For them, the Nazi assault on Jewish families was an attack on the universal foundations of human civilization. The horrendous treatment of older Jews, who in Akan culture will be revered not only as elders, but also as custodians of community histories and culture, completed the Akan view of the Nazi regime as a universal moral aberration. In fact, in June 1942, one very prominent Akan barrister who had been trained at Inner Temple in London wrote to the acting governor, Ernest London, asking for some information about what the Nazis had done to the Czechoslovak village of Lidice, because the BBC had reported that the Gestapo chief Reinhard Heydrich had been shot in this Bohemian or Czechoslovak village of Lidice, and what the Germans had done is that they had moved to the village, they had killed all the men in the village, and then transported all the women and the children to different concentration camps. For the accounts of the Gold Coast who revered the idea of the family, that was pretty shocking. And it was shocking to the extent that they wanted to find out why Europeans would do something like this. When Africans who had embraced European missionary Christianity discussed the silence of Christian nations in Europe, And I think this is particularly important for a Catholic school. When Africans who had become Christians through colonization discussed the silence of Christian nations in Europe to anti-Jewish persecution and discrimination on their continent, they did so in astonishment of the participation of Christian nations such as France and Italy in these anti-Semitic activities. Some African analysts of anti-Semitism in Europe offered unique theological interpretations of what they were reading. If Europeans could hate Jews so much, Jews who shared the heritage of Jesus of Nazareth, then Europeans are not Christians. They are pagans. So here, African educated people from missionary schools began to interpret anti-Semitism as a form of Christian paganism. And their response was that anti-Semitism raises fundamental questions about the credibility of the European missionary project in Africa. If colonialism was a civilizing mission as Europeans claimed, then the persecution of Jews undermined that particular narrative that colonialism was a civilizing mission. Because the persecution of Jews was the highest expression in their view of barbarity. And therefore, Europe, through anti-Semitism, has become a museum of barbarism. The response was that European Christian missionaries should retire to Europe and then preach Christianity to Europeans in a continent that was in a state of decay. Not only that, they saw anti-Semitism as the decline of Western civilization. If Jews who had contributed so much to the flowering of Western civilization in music, art, philosophy, science, were no good to be part of Europe, then European civilization that is being presented as the outgrowth of classical Greece is moribund. It is in decay. Therefore, some Africans concluded that anti-Semitism presents an opportunity for Africans. Africans should mobilize themselves in a reverse missionary project. Africans should go to Europe as missionaries, take over Europe, and then Africanize Europe, inculcate African humanity and humanism to Europe. In other words, Africans should go to Europe as missionaries in order to preach African versions of virtue. To be fair, there were some Christians in Europe who spoke out against crusading anti-Semitism. In fact, the West African pilot gave special coverage to the views expressed by Dr. Henry A. Wilson, the Anglican Bishop of Chelmsford, after Germany annexed Austria in March 1938 and launched violent persecutions against Vienna's Jews. Now, Wilson echoed the connections that African educated elites were making between anti-Semitism and fascist Italy's invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 and the use of poison gas in Ethiopia at this particular time. In fact, in September 1938, the West African pilot pounced on Dr. Wilson's critique of Western civilization through the desecration of treaties and then also the persecution of Vienna's Jews. The West African pilot pounced on it in order to highlight two things that were happening in Europe and perhaps this may have some resonance for our contemporary political experiences. The West African pilot was particularly critical of the barring of Jewish students from Italian universities. 1938, Benito Mussolini decreed that Jews would not, particularly Jewish students, would not be accepted in Italian universities. And Jewish students who had citizenship in Italy, they had their citizenship revoked as well. So the barring of admission of Jews to German universities and the revocation of the citizenship of Italian Jews struck a chord in West Africa. Now, the point I am trying to make as I get to my concluding remark is that people in Africa paid attention to the Holocaust. If you read a book on the Holocaust, you might think that the only region that had a historical connection to the Holocaust was North Africa. I submit, West Africa and East Africa did too. And it is when we look at the East African and West African perceptions and interpretations of anti-Semitism and the meanings that they ascribed to anti-Semitism that we begin to understand one fundamental thing about African history: African humanism. By that I mean the kinds of moral impulses that people in Africa exhibited in order to rehumanize the dehumanized. People in Africa tried to make Jews authentic and legitimate human beings, while in Europe, Jews were being treated otherwise. In fact, the African response to anti-Semitism as an integral part of the overall African reactions to the Holocaust gives us some fundamental lessons about how people in Africa, by their deeds, presented themselves as the moral opposite of the Europeans who sought to colonize them. In other words, the Holocaust and anti-Semitism discredited the European colonial enterprise. Let me conclude with the following thought. Anti-Semitism as a form of prejudice and discrimination did not surprise colonial subjects in East and West Africa. They had experienced that. It's no big deal. Anti-Semitism as discrimination, no big deal. We have experienced that too. Well, our experience and the Jewish experience exist on the same spectrum of the Nazi perception of the despised and expendable. But anti-Semitism as annihilation, extermination, was beyond the pale. So they were used to prejudice and discrimination based on anti-African and anti-black racism. But in their colonial context, they had experiences. But the use of anti-Semitism by a European nation as a tool of persecution and annihilation of Jews, and the collaboration of some Christian nations in Europe with this crime, startled colonial subjects immensely. Anti-Semitism as persecution and annihilation of European Jews had 4 unintended but nonetheless interrelated consequences in Africa. One, it undermined the European claim to moral and racial superiority as the justification of European colonialism in Africa. Two, anti-Semitism increased anti-colonial sentiment in Africa and marked the beginning of the end of European empires on the African continent. This is my unique contribution to African historiography. For those of you who have taken courses on African history, you will read that decolonization, that is the struggle to end European imperialism on the African continent, began immediately after the end of World War II, when African ex-servicemen, that is African soldiers who had fought in Europe, encountered poverty in Europe. And then African soldiers who fought side by side Europeans came away with the feeling that if a bullet hit a European, he screamed just as painfully as an African did. Therefore, the aura of invincibility and the perception of superiority that surrounded Europeans in the colonial narrative came tumbling down in the throes of World War II. And when the ex-soldiers returned, they were no longer prepared to respect Europeans. Many Africans who look at the consequences or impact of World War II as integral to the end of colonial rule emphasize the role of the returning African soldiers as the vanguard of the anti-colonial movement. I have moved that narrative a little notch further. I argue that no, in fact, the edifice of the colonial empire had begun to crumble in 1933. If colonialism began soon after the Berlin Conference of 1884, the Holocaust and anti-Semitism began to cast doubt on the salience and significance of the colonial project. And the silence of Christian nations to anti-Semitism actually made people in Africa question not only Western civilization, but actually the entirety of the colonial project. So my argument is that, in fact, it was anti-Semitism and the Holocaust that represented the beginning and the end of European colonial rule. So, 3, the anti-Jewish campaign also undercut Germany's demand for a return of its former colonies to it. And 4, anti-Semitism produced the earliest skeptics of European Christian evangelism in colonial Africa. If the Holocaust made many Jews atheists, anti-Semitism made many Africans atheists. They began to believe that if white people, Christians, could persecute Jesus' kinsfolk, then in fact Europeans have sold Africans a bill of detestable goods. Anti-Semitism and the Holocaust produced the earliest skeptics of Christianity on the African continent. But the broader lesson, in my view, of the African press discourse on anti-Semitism from 1933 to 1945 is that it shed light on African humanism, that is, African moral impulses, the African opposite of the European at this particular moment. Especially the type of moral impulse that equally dehumanized groups showed towards their peers in Nazism's hierarchy of the despised and expendable. Nowhere was this African humanism expressed in its most profound form than in the declaration by President W.V.S. Tubman of Liberia in January 1944. He proclaimed in the Liberian legislature what embodies what I have presented here as African humanism. And even though Liberia had the best diplomatic relations with Germany, and Liberia obtained not only diplomatic support but military aid from Germany, the president of Liberia proclaimed, and I quote, "I am opposed to Nazism, not because it is of German origin, but because I have believed and I am convinced that it was contrived to be and is being used as a subtle but potent instrument to effect the dissolution and destruction by treachery of everything that stands for morality, humanity, justice, righteousness, and common decency." It is in the African discourse on anti-Semitism that we begin to understand the finest of African humanity. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Kissy. So why don't we take a question from the audience? Anybody would like to ask him a question? Or comment, or any of... Barbara.
I guess I would ask why you think this is such an under-researched topic if it has such big, had such big impact on that.
Okay, wait. The question was, why is this such an under-researched topic?
Yes. That's a very, very excellent question. Why is this topic, what I'm talking about, an under-researched topic, and I'll say an under-researched topic in two disciplines: African history, Holocaust history. It is under-researched because every discipline has its foundational topics. In African history, the major topics, the major foundational topics are the transatlantic slave trade, the scramble for colonies in Africa by Europeans, the partition of the African continent into colonies, the colonial state, the First and Second World Wars, decolonization, and the rise of the post-colonial nation state and contemporary Africa. I've given you a summary of the major themes in African history. I think, as Professor Afridi will bear with me also, in Holocaust history, the Holocaust is often studied as a distinctively European experience. That the Holocaust is a Jewish story. The Holocaust happened in Europe. There is even a debate among scholars whether, by viewing the Holocaust as Dr. Afridi and I do, from outside of Europe, is sacrilege, is conceptual and analytical sacrilege. That if we study the Holocaust beyond Europe, we are robbing the Holocaust of its context. In other words, we are decontextualizing the Holocaust from its European epicenter.
Professor Afridi has asked a very, very potent question with her colleague, Mark Selensak, in a book that she just autographed for me, and a book that I also endorsed. That's a critical question. What are the new perspectives that we get when we study the Holocaust beyond Europe? And that is one of the perspectives that I just gave you that elicited this excellent question. The reason why it has been an under-researched topic is that the focus has always been on the traditional and conventional themes. I decided to change it. And I encourage you to have that habit of mind as a student. Look at what has been done. Don't poo-poo it, but say to yourself or ask yourself, what are the things that have been left at the margins, the under-researched things that I can take up and then bring into the narrative? I decided that as a scholar of African history who studies the Holocaust, I cannot compete with European colleagues of mine who study the Holocaust and who are of Jewish heritage and who may understand the Holocaust better than I do. I can't compete with them. I can learn from them. But as an Africanist, I am also not interested in some of the tried and tested conventional themes. I want something new. And given the fact that the only region of the African continent that is well researched in relationship to the Holocaust is North Africa, I am going to look at the regions that are under-researched, East Africa and West Africa. And what I'm going to do is to bring two disciplines that don't talk to each other, Holocaust history and African history, and force them to talk to each other. That is what I just did. I forced Holocaust history and African history to talk to each other. And you see the illuminating perspectives that I laid out. Okay. And the reason why it has been under research is that, and I call for more such perspectives, not only on Holocaust history, African history, but the intersection of both disciplines. Excellent question. Any other? Any other questions? Who can replicate what the young student just shared with us? If you are not asking questions, then I will do the unconventional, since I've told you I am not a conventional scholar. Okay. Who can summarize for us what I have shared with you for the last 40 to 50 minutes? What did I say? Suppose you live here and you say, hey, where did you go? So I went to listen to a lecture on the African press and anti-Semitism before and during the Holocaust, and said, what did the person say? What are you going to tell the person? What have I shared with you? What are you taking home with you? Or what are you going to make of what I just shared with you? If you are not asking me questions, then I want to, excellent.
I'll summarize it.
Yes.
So pretty much what you're talking about is that anti-Semitism is, you just described it as a hatred of Jews, and that's how people in Africa views it.
Yes.
And then you were talking about from 1933 to 1945, and the main question was there hatred of Jews before 1933 in Africa? And then if so, how does the press deal with that? And then if there wasn't it, how would they describe something new? And then pretty much you were saying that there was no hatred of Jews before or during the Holocaust because Jewish people were already integrated into the culture of Africa. And then lastly, people in Africa were really interested in what was going on in the Holocaust because if like Germans could kill white people, what would they do to black people?
Very good. That is a stenographic mind. That is a masterful stenographic mind. He took very good notes. So I teach a course on African history to 1850 and the history and theory of genocide. Every time I get to class, I will not start the class until I find out what students learned from the previous interaction. So the first question I ask is, what did I say the last time that we met? And now what I also do, at this time that we are wrestling with the extent to which what we study will give us a career of meaning, I ask students, what kind of job can you pursue with the information that I shared with you the last time that we met? In other words, which career in the world today can you pursue with the information that I shared with you on African history from the dawn of human history to 1850? Now, since we have run out of time, I am not going to ask you which career or careers in the world today can you pursue with the information that I shared with you about the African press and anti-Semitism. Okay. All right. Dr. Afridi, take it over from me, please.
Yeah. I have one question. So, I realize you say that you made a comment about Africans seeing colonists killing Jews, so white people killing white people, correct? Right? However, when you're teaching about anti-Semitism and you're looking at Nazi Germany, the problem is race for the Germans. So even that becomes very interesting, right? So these are Jewish Germans living in Germany for over 1,000 years that may look seemingly European. However, they are not. So can you speak to that? Because I think that's super, super important, especially because of the last decade in this country and how we talk about Jews as passing white. It's really crucial that you talk about this. Thank you.
That is a very, very, very excellent question.
Well, thank you.
And the answer was intrinsic to the narrative that I constructed. For the African scholars, but for the Africans, particularly those who had been educated in missionary schools, and who disliked the idea that colonialism was a civilizing mission, that they had to be socially and intellectually re-engineered because they are inferior. They never accepted that. And so the educated elite saw racism as a social construct. They did not want, even though in some of the discourse, they saw Europeans and Jews as interrelated racially. For them, culture was the most important. They saw Germans and Europeans as having cultural affinities more than racial similarity. They never distinguished between Europeans and Jews. Not only were they physically similar, that they were also culturally similar. As I mentioned, they saw Jews as having kinship with Jesus Christ. It was not racial. It was cultural in terms of African notions of kinship. And so they saw the Germans and the other Europeans also as having civilizational kinship. Jews had done a lot to nurture European civilization. In fact, there was a big January 10th, 1939 West African Empire. If you can find it by Google, I doubt. A big banner. Jews have helped modern civilization. And the West African pilot recounted the numerous scientific breakthroughs and discoveries that Jews had made. The Jews had made human civilization better for all of us. Why consider them expendable? That's an irony. It's just simply a crisis of the imagination. And so, even though race was a subtext to the discourse, they did not want to accept race as the actual subtext, because by accepting that, they also racialized themselves. And they didn't want that. They discussed it to a very limited extent racially, but in fact in kinship and cultural terms, and in civilizational terms. That is why they felt, if the Europeans are doing this, we have to go and then have an African missionary enterprise there, and then convert them not through African missionary activities, but African humanism. This is very important. And maybe someday I shall come back to give another lecture for a Catholic university about the concept of mission in Christian theology. No African belief system had missionaries. None. There is no, with the exception of the other monotheistic religions that came, Islam, Christianity, and others. But indigenous African religious beliefs did not have missionaries. And so the idea of having missionaries to convert somebody, was strange. But if the Europeans did that, and then we realize that they are not living to the best of their eschatological ideals, then there must be an African missionary enterprise in order to convert Europeans to African humanism. Not African religion, African humanism. Okay. So, excellent question.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kissy. Let's give him a really big hand and applause. Thank you for coming. Have a really wonderful evening. And maybe I'll see you next Thursday for our next event. Good night, everyone, and students, see you next week.
And thank you very much. You have been wonderful.